On the night of March 31, 1922, the disaster struck a small Bavarian farm at 43 miles north of Munich, Germany. All the residents of the farm were killed with a mattock, and the mysterious murders remained unresolved. A few days before these murders, the father, Farmer Andreas Gruber, told the neighbors that he had discovered a mysterious imprint that led from the edge of the forest to the farm, but none of them went home. Furthermore, the keys to the house disappeared a few days before the terrible crime. Life on the farm became strange when their maid, Maria, told the family to leave the farm immediately. She had listened to the voices around the house and was awake at night by the sound of stairs with no one in attic. When she realized that the evil had invaded the house and feared for safety and mental health, she told the family to leave, and within 6 months it would have been tragically proven that she was right. There were 6 victims of this bloody night. The parents, Andreas and Kazilia, their widowed daughter Victoria Gabriel, their children Kazilia and Joseph, the new maid, Maria. We will never know exactly what happened that night, but it is thought that the person who killed them brought all the family members one at a time into the barn, except for the little Joseph, who was killed in bed, and the maid. Autopsy report by Dr. John Baptist Allmuller, a doctor at the court, showed that Kazilia showed signs of strangulation and 7 blows to the head that caused a broken skull. Her husband's face was beaten so that his cheekbones protruded from his broken face. Victoria's skull was broken and her head carried several star-shaped wounds. The jaw of young Kazilia was broken and her neck and face were covered with large open wounds. The 7-year-old girl was not killed on the spot, and it is thought that while she was stuck in the dark with her dead parents beside her in the barn, there was a real panic. He was terrified and tore his hair with a terrible fear, too terrified to ask for help. Inside the farm, little Joseph and the maid were killed with a blow to the head and face. The killer probably stayed at home for another 4 days after the murder. The neighbors saw the smoke coming out of the chimney. The farm animals were fed and someone, probably the murderer, took the trouble to milk the cows. The killer himself used the kitchen and prepared meals on the farm. On April 4th, the neighbors arrived at the farm because the family had not been seen for 4 days and Kazilia had not gone to school. Moreover, the postman noticed that mailbox had remained untouched, which was no surprise, because the whole family, including the maid, had been terribly murdered in cold blood. The police at first pointed the finger at vagrants, or vague traveling men of bad repute, as potential culprits. But this theory was abandoned when large sums of money were discovered untouched in the house. The previously employed maid was questioned and said that she heard out strange noises of the house that gave feeling of cold and being watched. The police contacted Lorenz Schlittenbauer, who had a love affair with Victoria and was none other than the man who brought the research group home on April 4th. Lorenz was suspected of being Joseph's father and married Victoria without his father's intervention. The police also considered a pact for murder and suicide between Andreas and Victoria, but this idea was abandoned when the injuries proved incompatible with such an event. In 1923, the farm was burned to the ground. In 1999, the police were contacted by an elderly woman who claimed her former landlord had information about the Hinterkaifeck affair. Officials investigated, but discovered the suspect had already died. With relatives still alive, the name of the suspect was never circulated. In 2007, a team of police academy students used modern detection techniques to investigate the unsolved murder. The students narrowed the search down to one suspect, but they didn't name him or her, again out of respect for the suspect's living relatives. So the case remains open and likely to stay that way. The Junko Furuta case is a true crime story that is sure to shock and disturb even the most hardened true crime enthusiasts. This case, which occurred in Japan in the late 1980s, involved the brutal abduction, torture, and murder of a 16-year-old girl by a group of young men. The case is considered one of the most heinous and disturbing crimes in Japanese history and continues to be a source of fascination and horror. Junko Furuta was a 16-year-old girl from the city of Mitaka, Japan, who lived with her parents and siblings. She was a bright and ambitious student, who was well liked by her peers and teachers. However, Her life was tragically cut short when she was abducted by a group of young men in November of 1988. The abduction of Junko Furuta was a shock to the community, and the police immediately launched an investigation. However, despite their best efforts, they were unable to find any leads or clues as to the whereabouts of the young girl. It wasn't until January of 1989 that her body was found in a drainage ditch, and the autopsy revealed that she had been brutally tortured and murdered. The investigation into the murder of Junko Furuta was long and arduous, with the police interviewing countless individuals and following up on numerous leads. However, it wasn't until the arrest of 4 young men, who were all under the age of 18, that the true horror of the crime was revealed. The 4 men had kidnapped Junko Furuta and taken her to an abandoned building, where they proceeded to torture and abuse her for a period of 44 days. The details of the torture and abuse that Junko Furuta endured during her 44 days of captivity are truly disturbing and shocking. The young men subjected her to unimaginable acts of violence and cruelty, including rape, torture with lit cigarettes, and even forced her to drink her own urine. The abuse was so severe that she eventually died from the injuries she sustained. The trial of the 4 young men was a media sensation in Japan and around the world, with the public demanding justice for the innocent young girl. In the end, all 4 men were found guilty of the abduction, torture, and murder of Junko Furuta and were sentenced to lengthy prison terms. The Junko Furuta case is considered one of the most heinous and disturbing crimes in Japanese history. The brutal nature of the crime and the fact that the perpetrators were all young men make it a particularly chilling and terrifying story. The case continues to be a source of fascination and horror for true crime enthusiasts and for people who want to learn more about this case, and it's a reminder of how evil humanity can be. Edward Paisnel is a serial killer who terrorized people in the 60s in the island between England and France. In late 50s he started to attack women and injuring them after he sexually abused them. In 1960 Paisnel, called the Beast of Jersey, started to attack people indoors, especially children and women, and raping them. At that time the police identified him to attack on moonlight weekends between 10 p.m. and 3 a.m. wearing a scary face mask. He used to select victims carefully, and usually entered through the bedroom window. Once inside he tied his victims' hands and placed a rope around their necks, tacking them to a nearby field and performing sexual acts. Once finished he would return them home. He spoke a lot during the attacks in a soft Irish accent. He mentioned a wife, a dead mother, and that he murdered before. He also often spoke of dropping either a lighter or a cigarette behind. Edward Paisnel was meticulous, leaving breadcrumbs to a man that didn't exist, and it left the detectives stumped. So stumped that he went on with crimes. In 1966 he wrote a letter to the police saying, "My dear sir, I think that it's just the time to tell you that you are just wasting your time. As every time I have done what I always intended to do, and remember, it will not stop at this. But I will be fair to you and give you a chance. I have never had much out of this life, but I intend to get everything I can now. I have always wanted to do the perfect crime. I have done this, but this time let the moon shine very bright in September, because this time it must be perfect. Not 1 but 2. I am not a maniac by a long shot, but I like to play with you people. You will hear from me before September, and I will give you all the clues. Just to see if you can catch me. Yours very sincerely, Wait and See." Paisnel's last attack occurred on August 1970 when a 13-year-old awoke to a bright light in his face. He was taken from his bed and sexually assaulted in Edward's usual fashion, then returned home. The bee was threatened into silence, but his fear and paranoia of the man returning sparked him to speak. He described the beast, but there was a change. Boy's body sported the same scratches in the former attack. It was now over a decade, and it didn't appear that Paisnel would ever be caught, that is, until one little red light. Police actually caught him when he jumped a traffic red light with his car. He got out of the car and began to run. He was taken to the police station, and detectives realized he was more than a routine arrest. He wore a long overcoat with inch-long nails in the lapels and shoulders. His wrists were clad with nail-studded bracelets, old trousers tucked into his socks, carpet slippers, woolen gloves, and inside the lining of his coat was a rubber mask. Paisnel explained that his strange outfit was because he belonged to a secret society, an elite group of Satanists. Officers actually discovered many occult objects inside his house and false eyebrows, homemade wigs and hats, a camera and several photos of various homes. Paisnel admitted his fascination with the dark disciplines and his inspiration to Gilles de Rais. In November 29, 1971, he was declared guilty and charged with 13 counts of assault, rape, and sodomy and sentenced to 30 years in prison. 3 years later he was released for good behavior and exiled to Isle of Wight, where he died of heart attack in 1994. Rhoda Derry was a normal woman living in a small town. She had a husband and 2 children, and she worked as a teacher at the local elementary school. However, her life took a dark turn when she found herself trapped in a cage, forced to endure a horror story unlike any other. It all started on a dark and stormy night. Rhoda was at home with her family, preparing for bed when she heard a knock at the door. When she opened it, she was faced with 2 men in black clothing and masks. Without warning, they overpowered her and dragged her out of her house, throwing her into a waiting van. Rhoda woke up to find herself in a small, dark room. She was trapped in a cage with no way to escape. She quickly realized that she was being held captive by a group of sadistic criminals who were using her as a test subject in a twisted experiment. The criminals would come to visit her regularly, taunting and tormenting her with cruel words and crueler actions. They would force her to watch as they experimented on other prisoners, and they would subject her to a variety of terrifying scenarios, including being submerged in water, being locked in a dark room for days on end, and being subjected to extreme temperatures. Despite the constant abuse, Rhoda never gave up hope. She knew that if she could survive long enough, someone would eventually come to rescue her. She also knew that she had to keep her spirits up and never let the criminals break her. However, as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks turned into months, Rhoda began to lose hope. She was becoming weaker and weaker, and she knew that it was only a matter of time before she died in that cage. Finally, after months of captivity, Rhoda's worst fears were realized. The criminals had grown tired of her and decided to end her life. However, they didn't want to make it quick and easy. They wanted to prolong her suffering and make it as painful as possible. They locked her in a room with a single light bulb, and they left her there to die. Rhoda was left alone in the dark, cold room with nothing but her thoughts and the sound of her own screams. In the end, Rhoda's nightmare was finally over, but the horror of her story will never be forgotten. Her tragic death serves as a reminder of the evil that exists in this world and the lengths that some people will go to satisfy their twisted desires. Rhoda's story is a warning to us all, to never take our freedom for granted and to always be vigilant against those who would seek to harm us.